This is topic 1 in Unit 1, Introduction to Statistics. Before we get into any material for the course, it's really important to understand what statistics is and why it is something that you should know. In this first unit, there are 11 topics. This unit offers students the advantage in that many of you have heard of some of this material before. You may know how to do some of the calculations that we are going to do. In Unit 2, it's some of the material you may be familiar with, and then in Units 3, 4, and 5, it's pretty unlikely, unless you've taken Math 1000, that you've had any experience with the material that we are going to cover. So we're going to start with the 6 very typical questions, and it's kind of the who, what, where, when, how, and why. So what is statistics? When is it used? Who uses statistics? Why is statistics used? Where is it important? And what does statistics mean to you? So the first question, what is statistics? Very simply put, statistics is the science of data. I do have 2 definitions here from the optional textbook for the course as well as the free dictionary. So from the Triola text, statistics is the science of planning studies and experiments, obtaining data, and then organizing, summarizing, presenting, analyzing, interpreting, and drawing conclusions based on the data. The definition from the free dictionary, the mathematics of the collection, organization, and interpretation of numerical data, especially the analysis of population characteristics by inference sampling. So I mentioned this in the introduction video that many people say, oh, hey, I'm good at math, or I'm not good at math. And they use that as a kind of preconceived idea of how they're going to do in statistics. We do obviously use mathematics in statistics, but it is very different. We're not really spending a lot of time, solving for X or doing any of those traditional things. What we do is typically very new. So we're going to be using primarily software to kind of do number crunching. And so then we'll talk in a little bit about, okay, well, I've heard the word data a lot. Why do we need to get data? So that's going to be one of our next questions. So next, when is statistics used? Statistics is going to be used anytime that you have a question where the answer is not a known fact, or in a lot of cases, this fact is, it's not possible for there to be a true known fact. We just need to kind of get an estimate. So there are 2 major instances when we will need statistics. The first is to answer a question when it is not possible, or there is not enough time or money to look at every individual item. And the second is that when you want to use current information to make predictions about the future. So in a way, we're kind of scientific fortune tellers. So we're going to make predictions, but we're going to use strongly backed theoretical processes to do that. Who uses statistics? Well, everyone's first thought, I think, is typically a statistician. But in reality, everybody should at least have some kind of understanding of statistics so that if you have any exposure to it, you kind of have an understanding of what has happened. So you might think you may never use it, but if you want to make some kind of claim or statement that doesn't already have an answer, and someone says, hey, how do you, that's not true, or how do you know that's true? Well, there's a really good chance that you're going to need to use statistics unless you're arguing about something that's very black and white, like what is the capital of New York? So that obviously has a single answer. But something like how many calories do you burn walking up a flight of stairs? That's something that's going to change from person to person, as well as from yourself on different instances of walking up the stairs. Are you holding anything? Are you going fast or slow? So we would need statistics there because we would need an estimate. We don't have a solid answer for that question. How many calories does it take to walk up the stairs? So why is statistics important? Especially in your professional life, if you want to have respect, you need to make sure that you are making claims that are true. So sometimes you might make a claim and, then have, a back and forth with it and then say, hey, well, let's collect some data on this. So if you want to truly prove or disprove something that's not already a known fact, there's a very good chance that you will want to use statistics, or should. Where is statistics used? One thing that I think is super cool about statistics is that every single field, I guarantee, will either use or should be benefiting from statistics. So no matter what your major is, no matter what your current job is, no matter what your dream job is, you will be exposed to statistics in that field. Typically, people think about politics, especially with presidential elections. They are always reporting polls and other facts and figures like that. Video games, I am personally a very avid gamer myself, so I've actually done way too much data collection than I would like to admit in my own personal video gaming. Sports, I think, is what comes to the forefront the most, but any field at all either is already or should be using statistics. So the final question is what does statistics mean to you? So at the very minimum, the goal of this course is for everyone to leave with enough statistical knowledge so that when you hear information from articles or on the news, or somebody makes a claim on Facebook or something like that, you want to be able to determine if they have used a reliable process or if they, cut some corners or they're misrepresenting their information. So there's a lot of different edges that you can take just having some statistical knowledge with you. In a perfect world, you will use statistics beyond this class. So with a few exceptions, every single thing that we do is at a functional level, meaning that you can leave this class and do everything exactly how we have done it in a professional setting. And that's one thing about this course that I think is super cool. So we're going to start with some important definitions. I have this nice little image over there that we'll get to. So the first one is a population. When people hear the word population, I think they typically think about, like the people in the United States or, a country's population. Definitely a population. However, it's going to mean a lot more than just that now. So a population is the complete collection of all items or individuals to be studied. You can determine the population by asking yourself, who qualifies? So for example, if you are listening to the radio and they say, hey, call in if you have an opinion on the recent smoking ban vote. So the people that qualify are only the people that are listening to that radio station. So in this case, the population would be listeners of that radio station. A census, which typically people think about as, the census in the United States that happens every 10 years, is also going to be more broad now. So a census is any time every member of the population has been studied or talked to. So if I have a population of 50 iPhones that I have collected from a local Verizon store, and I'm interested in determining, okay, why are these broken? What has gone wrong? A census would be if I examined every single one of those cell phones. So a census is just any time every single member of the population has been examined. A sample is what we are typically going to be dealing with, and that is just a subset of members from a population. So for my cell phone example, if I only had the opportunity or time to look at 10 cell phones, then that would be a sample. So I've only examined 10 of those 50 cell phones that were collected from that store. On the right here, the image, the population is who qualifies. So in that circle, all of those dots represents either a person, it could be an iPhone, it could be a car, it could be really anything at all that you are studying. And then the sample, so those lines going down, those are the dots that are selected to be studied. So the sample exists of only those items or individuals that were chosen to be examined. Finally, data. Data is just the collection of observations. Data does not have to be just numbers. So data can be yes or no from each of my cell phones. Does the cell phone turn on? And I have 10 yes or no's from my sample. So it could be, a person's height. It could be, the number of pets that a person has. So it doesn't just have to be numeric. Data can even be something like a person's religion or their political affiliation. So one note that I want to make, that I'm going to continue to make and hopefully maybe even overemphasize, is that sample size becomes something that students really kind of latch onto. What we'll find, though, is that statistics is almost magical, at least to me, in that the sample that you select, if it is selected well, you don't even need that big of a sample size. In Unit 3, we are going to actually calculate sample sizes that we need, but until then, answering a question with a sample size not being big enough is a pretty big no-no. So try to keep that out of your mind. So if we're looking at the population of the United States, and I've only sampled 1,000 people, you can't just say, hey, the sample size isn't big enough, because there's way more to that picture than just the number 1,000. So if we selected those 1,000 people well, it's probably pretty likely that those 1,000 people are going to do a good job at representing the results we would have done if we had a census performed. So let's do an exercise. The first thing that I want to do here is just state the population and sample for each of these examples. So remember, the population is who qualifies, and then the sample you can think about as who participates. So our first example in exercise 1, in order to determine the academic goals of students at Casper College, 300 students were randomly selected by ID number and were questioned. So the college wanted to gather some information. There are around 5,000 students at Casper College at this time. And so they can't talk to everybody. It might not be possible to reach everyone. It might not be possible that there is enough time in the study to reach all of them. So a sample of 300, especially if they're selecting it randomly, which we'll talk about more, is probably going to do a pretty good job. So the population who qualifies, well, if you are not a Casper College student, then you will not qualify for this. There's some technicalities that you can always get into. If you're thinking of these technicalities, I always consider this to be a good thing. Overthinking things can sometimes be a problem, but in general, in statistics, if you're really spending time to understand a situation and analyze it, then that's a sign of being very thorough. So one comment that someone might make, well, what is this list? How are they getting all these Casper College students? Are they students that are currently enrolled? Are they, students that took classes last semester? Maybe they're not students anymore. So that's a detail that typically you won't need to give to me in a quiz or test, but it's something that I would hope that you would think about in your regular life as you're going through these examples and just in your regular life in general. So the sample is the who participated. So the 300 students that were randomly selected, so be specific here. So those were the participants that made up this sample here. So the 300 students. In our second example here, in order to determine the state of bridges in the United States, so are they sound? Are they safe? Do they need repairs? 100 bridges were selected and evaluated. So this is a case where, again, if you are pretty technical, you might say, okay, well, are these just, large bridges? Are they, bridges in a park that goes across a little stream? So and when you begin with this, you would need to decide, okay, what actually is a bridge that will be included here? So that's something that you would analyze more on the back end of things. So the population, who, not necessarily a who, but it's a good way to think about it. So the bridges in the United States, that's the only thing that qualifies. So a car, that's not going to qualify. So bridges in the United States. And then the sample, who participated. So 100 bridges were selected, and that is what makes up the sample, those 100 bridges. So one example that I'd like to align is that the scientific method and the process that we use in statistics are pretty similar. So this is something where sometimes statistics can be scientific, but it's not always necessarily. So if you look at the definition of scientific, it's something that you can repeat and reproduce. And this is something in statistics that we do sometimes with experiments. So it is a science, but it's kind of in this foggy area between, math and science, with statistics overlapping most of those pretty well. So the first step in the scientific method is to ask a question. And there is a project in this course. You do not need to worry about it right now at all, but I do like to talk about it so that it kind of gets you thinking. So the project in this course is going to follow these steps exactly. So you're going to start with a question. It does have to be a statistical question. We will talk about in a few slides what exactly a statistical question is. So this is a question that there's no solid answer and needs to be done by collecting data. The second step is to do background research. So this is where, for the bridge example, I would need to say, hey, what actually are we defining as a bridge that we want to include here? So we want to decide what to measure and what type of variables you are dealing with. Deciding what to measure is not always obvious. In the course after this, we would get into a lot more detail of deciding what actually to measure. So for us in 2050, it is going to be pretty clear as to what you exactly will be needing to measure. The third step is to construct a hypothesis. So in regular life, a lot of times people will say like, hey, I have a theory. And what they actually mean is I have a hypothesis, because a theory is something that is proven. A hypothesis is something is just that you think that isn't proven at all. So what do you think the outcome will be, and what are you testing for? So for example, my hypothesis might be that students that, I'm going to just make something up random, students that are taller have a higher GPA. Well, we probably already all know that this isn't true. However, I would need to actually collect data, get the heights of some students, get their GPAs. So that's something that there's not necessarily an obvious answer for, that we would need to research. So sometimes, even if it sounds silly, it's not a strong and confident answer until you have used statistics to prove. The fourth step is test your hypothesis by collecting data. And then, just like it says, this is the step where we would collect data in your project. You will be collecting your own data. And the last two steps, analyze your data and draw a conclusion. In this step, you're going to be doing descriptive and inferential statistics. So descriptive is just describing what you have, the data you've collected. And then inferential statistics, we want to infer what this data means beyond this. So how can we expand this to the entire population, or sometimes future populations? And then lastly, this is super important in statistics, but often gets left out, is communicating your results. So what actually is a statistical question? So this lecture has said a few times that statistics is used when there isn't an obvious answer to a question. Sometimes there's not, it's not possible, or there's not enough time or money to look at every individual item. So if we wanted to summarize the state of the bridges in the United States, we couldn't go and look at every single bridge. We, eventually that should be done at least at a state level. But this is something where, there's not enough time or money to go evaluate every single bridge. So we would want to randomly select them to just look at a few of them. So the next slide is going to have a second exercise here. And what you want to do is determine if the given question or scenario should require the use of statistics. This is something at first that you might not find yourself naturally being, you might not naturally think that way. So that's the point of this exercise, is to start bending your mind in a slightly different direction. In a lot of ways, this is like going to the gym and exercising a new muscle that you didn't even know that you had, let's say. So it's the same thing with your brain. You are kind of going to have to start to think in a different way, and not everybody is used to doing that. And you'll find over the course you'll get better at it pretty quickly. So the first scenario, a student wants to determine if their GPA is higher in their first academic semester or their second. So the question you want to ask yourself is this a fact or figure that's already known, or is this something that, we have to figure out? Well, the GPA is published on the transcript every semester. So the first academic semester, the student knows their GPA. And then the second academic semester, it's implied that it's finished here. So that number is already known. So we don't need to use statistics to compare the two numbers. However, statistics was used to actually determine the GPA. So each course has a number of credits and a grade assigned from the instructor, and then a weighted average is taken. So the grade based on how many credits it's worth eventually encompasses the entire GPA. So how many calories are burned walking up 2 flights of stairs in the physical science building? So this was something that was mentioned a little bit earlier on in this lecture. So even from one person to another, depending on those people's weights, it's basically impossible that they'll burn the same amount of calories going up the stairs. So even from one person, from one day to another, there still is going to be a difference in the amount of calories burned, even if it's a tenth of a calorie or even smaller. Depending on the speed or whether or not they're carrying something, they may burn a different amount of calories than they did a previous time in the day. A company wants to use their profits from last year to make a prediction about next year. This is definitely a case where statistics would need to be used because they are making a prediction about something that is completely unknown. So they would want to take the data from the previous year, depending on what variables they want to collect with it. It could be the amount spent on advertising. It could be the amount of products that they were carrying to sell. So there's a lot of other things that would be taken into consideration along with their sales, but the statistics would definitely need to be used. A baseball team wants to determine if their proportion of wins at home is greater with their stadium roof open or closed for the 2014 season. So we wouldn't need statistics here. The team would already know which games they had their roof open or closed, and they definitely know whether they had won or lost those games. In sports, they keep track of everything at all. Any kind of stats for sports you can definitely find. It's available and it's reported. And there's a lot of people that are interested in sports that actually follow the data with it. So sports is pretty cool. We will definitely look at some football data as well as baseball data. And I try to vary the topics that we look at. So we won't only look at sports. We'll look at all sorts of topics. So this one is kind of surprising to some students. What is the high temperature today in Casper, Wyoming? Well, statistics will be needed here. So even from one place to the next, one side of a house to the other side of the house, the temperature will very unlikely be the same on each of those. So if you're trying to report a high temperature, do you report the single highest temperature that was recorded in Casper, Wyoming that day? Do you take different highs in different parts of Casper and find an average for them? So it actually is more difficult than it seems. We will talk about weather a lot in Unit 2, the probability section, on weather reporters get a lot of negativity thrown at them. But in a way, I think that it's honestly a miracle that they are able to report as well as they do, which when I say that, people usually are very skeptical of the weather until we describe a little bit more with that. So in theory, let's say that it's possible that there could be a way to monitor the temperature in every single moment in area in Casper. So technically that would be an infinite amount of measuring. So if we did have the single highest number, would that still be the one that we would report? Because only one place or maybe a few places in Casper would experience that temperature. Or would we use a different way to combine all of the high temperatures and summarize them and put them together? So that's something that we will get a little bit more technical with later on in Unit 1. So this is our last one. A hairstylist wants to determine if their tips are higher in the year before or the year after they attended a new training course. So I have two cases for this one. So the first scenario is that if the hairstylist knew every single tip amount that they had received in the year before and the year after, every single one, you wouldn't need statistics because you could just compare those two numbers. But I'm going to mention a very big disclaimer here is that numbers alone, it's kind of apples to oranges. So we don't know what tip amount the person is getting for what amount of sale. So for example, if you go in and you get your hair colored, it takes like 2 hours. And if you have that done, you're going to tip them more than if you just go in for a quick trim, no matter what, most likely, unless it's a really horrible job. So this is where I like to bring up that percentages are going to be completely essential here, because if we want to make a comparison of those two, we would need to see if the percentage before was higher than the percentage after. So if the hairstylist knew every single tip amount or tip percentage that they had, we wouldn't need statistics. However, if they only had the tip percentages for just some of the customers, maybe just the credit card customers, or maybe some cash, some credit, then you would need to use statistics because you just have a little subset, a sample of the tips that they had received. So this section is a little bit, I would say, confusing in general, because there's always a lot of different edges to consider. So the goal of this was just to get you in the right frame of thinking and get used to thinking that way. So speaking of thinking statistically, I have a few examples here that I want to look at that will, again, continue to get you thinking in the right direction. So this is really easy to say, but one important skill is common sense. Everybody has different experiences and backgrounds, so I honestly believe that in a way common sense here is I don't know, unrealistic. But one thing that I want you to start with is that never just accept any information. Always kind of question everything. I always say in class, question everything short of being too paranoid. So, I mean, you don't want to go get out a tinfoil hat, but you can't just accept information if it comes from, a source or a method that you think may be unreliable. People on the internet just make stuff up. So a lot of times on the internet, when you say, hey, what is your source? The person just like disappears. I always like to think too is so not just what the information is, but who is reporting this information. So if it's, some kind of Republican publication posting something that's, against Democrats or makes Democrats look bad, or vice versa, I would kind of take that with a grain of salt anyway. There's a very famous quote, there are lies, damned lies, and then there are statistics. This is a quote from Mark Twain. And that is very naive at this point to believe, because the theory is very strong and backed. But people just make stuff up, and that really makes the general opinion of statistics unreliable. So if you're actually using statistics and you know what you're doing, it's very, very trustful. But if you're just making stuff up, which a lot of people do on the internet especially, then you definitely, maybe don't even consider what they're saying at all. So the first thing, context. What does it represent? What does it mean? The second, the source of the data. Who has funded the research and performed the sampling and analysis? Sometimes things have happened with certain studies and experiments where a person inputting the data was lazy or, very careless. And that actually can be a reason for error. How is the data collected? We mentioned this a little bit before with my disclaimer, please don't say sample size, it's too small. If it's collected in a proper way, the sample size can be so small. It's still shocking to me even after teaching this class for a number of years, as well as, studying statistics. Conclusions, what does the data tell us? Sometimes it tells you nothing. If it's a proper statistical analysis that's done, even if you don't get a specific result, it still is a result. Sometimes you hear a fact or figure and it's completely reliable or unreliable, and it doesn't tell you anything. You just discard it from your thoughts. Practical implications, what does the data mean for the population? And again, sometimes it's nothing, but everything that we do is almost always going to utilize real data. So it usually will tell you at least a little bit of something. So exercise 2, the following gives the height of men in inches along with their shoe size. So this is something that I think might go together, height and shoe size. Oops. Yeah, let me get that back there. Okay. So what questions do you have about this data? I would want to know, who are these people? Are they related? Are they all the same race? Are they the same nationality? So those are the types of questions that you want to think about when it says what questions do you have? Did the same person take the measurements from the heights? Where the shoe sizes all measured in shoe sizes used by the United States. So many times if you go to buy shoes, they have not just the US shoe sizes, they also have, the UK shoe size and some other shoe sizes on there. So that's one question I would want to ask, because you can't compare things on different measuring scales, apples, oranges. They don't go together. So does it make sense to think about a relationship between these two variables? I would say so. I think that it does make sense to think that height and shoe size go together. Not if your shoe size is bigger than someone else's, you may or may not be taller than them. And that's not what I'm saying. But I do think that if a person has a really big shoe size, they've got a man has a size 15 shoe, they are probably taller than a man that has a size 8 shoe. So in general, I think they do kind of go together. And then what can we conclude? Well, I don't have enough information to make any conclusions about this data. But if this was a summary example, the bigger the shoe size in general on this table, the taller the person is. So I would say in general, the taller the person, the bigger their shoe size. But again, if we wanted to prove that, we would actually have to run a test. Everything that you want to prove in statistics will be the result of some kind of statistical test. So I haven't proven anything. It's still just a hypothesis that I have yet to test. The second example, this is the number of trees in a person's yard along with how many chairs they have in their house. So what questions do you have about this data? So just before I say what I would think about it, is just think in general about a person in a house and their yard. So a person could live in a house in a city. They could live in a house that's on a big ranch. They could live in a house in the middle of the forest. So are these people all in the same, urban, rural setting? Or, some are in the city, some in the country? Are they in the same region of the United States? I'm from New York, and it is basically thick with these big, fat maple trees. So there's a lot of times just trees as far as the eye can see. Whereas in Wyoming, that is very different. So if I wanted to compare these two things, I would want them to be in the same living situation, urban or rural, or whatever, or in the same region in the United States, both. So I would want to compare these to more similar things. Does it make sense to think about the relationship between these two variables right away? No, I don't really think so. Somebody in one of my classes a few semesters ago was just like, well, what if they used the trees to make the chairs? In that case, I think that's the only case where it would make sense to think of the two variables together. But in general, if we want a chair, we go out and buy one from the store. So I don't really think that these two things do go together. That's one thing that we will talk about a lot between the rest of the course, is that you can put two things on the same graph or in the same chart together, but that doesn't mean that one causes the other or there's any relationship between them at all. And this is one thing I see in politics a lot. It's a complete facepalm, and people just eat it up. So be really careful. It's not always going to be as obvious in trees and chairs, but many times you get two things given to you and they don't go together, but you still buy it. It's really easy to do. So what can we conclude? I don't conclude anything. I would always guess lots of background information from a place where I have received data, but I mean, I don't even really see a relationship, even if we wanted to grasp one. The person with the least trees has the most chairs. The person with the most trees has the least chairs. Maybe there's some kind of relationship if we put them in a graph together, but that doesn't mean that it would be meaningful. Okay, so this is again an example that is a little bit kind of obnoxious, but it's the kind of thinking that you want to start becoming good at for when you are in the real world and things are a lot more complicated and convoluted, and you do want to say, hey, does this make sense to go together? So this is an example. It's a pretty foggy picture, so I'm going to read it. So it says, entering Hillsville, founded 1802, altitude 620, I'm assuming that is feet, population 3,700, and then total, they sum all those three things up and you get 6,122. Well, if you were thinking about this from a traditional math class perspective, all of these numbers are in different units. So even if you didn't want to think about it from a more common sense perspective, we can still use that math skill. Where units are important, and founded 1802, that's in years, altitude 620 feet, 3,700 people. You can't sum those three things up and get a single number total. So that just doesn't make sense at all. But again, when the example is kind of obnoxious, it is something that you'll notice, but in the real world, again, things get super complicated and it might not be something that you have a lot of knowledge about, so it can be more easy than you think to buy into something super funky. All right, and then lastly, this is something that I see on Facebook a ton. And this is just like, hey, it's something awareness week, and it doesn't usually have what week it is even. So it's like, I don't know, autism awareness week, like 38 weeks of the year, because people just keep sharing it. I mean, it's not bad to be aware of autism, but if I made something like this, I would put the date on it. So there's always some kind of number, like, hey, like 88% of people won't share this, or some kind of religious statement, and 92% of people won't share this. Well, 88%, what does that mean? So the statistic is referring to the 88%. My question is, did they actually collect data? No, they didn't, I would assume. So what can we conclude? Absolutely nothing. I would probably conclude that this person made up numbers. And again, people making stuff up really continues to translate into statistics in general, because people are distrustful because people make stuff up, these facts and figures. Whereas when statistics is actually used and it's used correctly, again, it's very theoretically sound and accepted across the board. So I wouldn't conclude anything. Okay, so 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate toothpaste. This gets brought up a lot because everyone's just like, well, how can 4 out of 5 dentists recommend this one and 4 out of 5 dentists recommend that one? So what questions do you have? I'm gonna put an excerpt from an article down here, and it's gonna address some of those questions we always have about these toothpaste facts here. So 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate toothpaste. Where did they get this from? What were the dentists that they talked to? Those were the types of questions I would want to know at the very basic of this. What can we conclude from this statistic? Well, if they did proper statistics here, I would conclude that 4 out of 5 dentists would recommend Colgate. However, this is a case where you don't necessarily have the full story, and this is why we are a little bit in disbelief with statistics and facts and figures that are reported, is because, well, something had to be left out here, because what if 3 out of 4 dentists recommend another type of toothpaste? How can those both be true at the same time? So this is an article. The maker of Listerine sues Procter & Gamble over the claim that 4 out of 5 dentists would recommend Crest mouthwash in the Southern District of New York. So in the article, the way that Procter & Gamble had come to this 4 out of 5 is that they sent the product to 344 dentists. Hopefully they randomly selected them, but even if they hadn't, there's still merit to their study that they did here. They were asked to use the product for 1 week, and they were paid to participate. A lot of times, people are like, oh, they can't be paid, that can kind of sway them. But it actually is legitimate to pay participants to participate. Monetary incentives are a very good way to get people to participate. And in a case like this, dentists are very busy professionals, so they are going to need an incentive to participate. Just recently, I got a thing in the mail that had a $5 bill in it, a real $5 bill, and was asking me to participate in a survey about cable. And I almost participated, but because of the $5, seriously. But I ended up actually losing the form. So I was going to participate when normally I wouldn't had participated before. So 269 dentists did participate, and they were asked, based on your experience using this oral rinse, which of the following statements best describes your most likely recommendation of this oral rinse to your patients? So according to the complaint, Procter & Gamble arrived at 4 out of 5 by combining those that said they would recommend and those that said that they would recommend only if their patients asked about it. So technically, did 4 out of 5 recommend? Well, yeah. Are they stretching the truth? That's something that would need to be decided in that lawsuit. So the lawsuit did allege that the hypothetical recommendation doesn't properly constitute the professionals recommending the product. So lots of little corners that people can cut in their language as well. So basically, pay attention. Don't believe anything unless, they have a good backing to it. So 2 considerations to take here. So a lot of the things in the previous exercise that we had looked at was, what are the practical implications? So there are 2 definitions here. The first one is a statistical significance, and this is methods of statistics indicate that a treatment is successful. And a treatment could be anything at all. It could be, a diet product. It could be using an iPad or an Android tablet. So a treatment is just some kind of action. It's not medicine like is typically thought of when you hear the word treatment. Practical significance is that common sense suggests that the finding doesn't make enough of a difference to justify the results. So let's look at a few examples to kind of illustrate this. One thing that I like about these terms is that the words themselves give you a kind of direction with what they do mean. So determine the statistical and practical, if any, significance of the following. 30 people are put on a specific diet plan, and it is found that after 1 year, the average weight loss was 3 pounds. Well, statistical significance, over the course of the year, there was a weight loss. So an average is something that we are going to talk about. It's just one way that you can represent a whole list of numbers. But they lost weight, and statistically, they did lose weight. Practically, however, 3 pounds over the course of a week isn't a lot of weight loss. So sometimes practical significance can have your own, personal touch come into this. So maybe if a person typically gains 10 pounds a year. So the last 5 years, they've gained 10 pounds each year. This is something that would be a big difference. If a person is, just trying to lose 10 pounds and they go on this diet and they're on it for a whole year, they might not find that 3 pounds over the course of a year is enough to justify what they had to go through to be on the diet. So personal feelings will come into that part. So the second one study showed that the flu vaccination was associated with a 71% reduction in flu-related hospitalizations among adults of all ages, and a 77% reduction among adults 50 years of age and older during the 2011-2012 flu season. This is actual information that is cited on the CDC, and they would have compared that to previous instances of the flu, those that have received the vaccination and who did not, as well as hospitalizations for those people. So statistically, there was a reduction in hospitalizations. So we definitely have a result that is positive. Less people went to the hospital. But not only that, is that a 71 and a 77% reduction is a pretty large figure. So I feel like even if, this study tended to favor into the flu shot, it's pretty unlikely that it would be so favorable and it would be so big in that direction. Even if they were a little bit off, it would still be a pretty significant reduction in hospitalizations. So I think this one is a little bit more difficult to argue the practical significance. There definitely seems to be one, in my opinion. So, in summary, two pieces that I would like you to take from this introduction section. The first is what statistics is and when it is used. So statistics, again, is the result of a question we need to answer that has required data to be collected. There's not an obvious answer. And secondly, this is I think the biggest thing for you to take along with you is that how to start to train your mind to think about statistics. Don't fall into the receiving end of our situation that we have below. So is a Dilbert comic here. And the first one, I didn't have any accurate numbers, so I just made this one up. Studies have shown that accurate numbers aren't more useful than the ones you make up. How many studies showed that? 87. So in this case, it's all just meaningless information. But a lot of times, I would say to this person, if they weren't saying, hey, I just made this up, I would say, hey, where did that number come from? And so then they would need to give me evidence to support that. So again, short of being paranoid, question everything.